Look at me when I speak to you, girl. Let me save the court some time. You'll never amount to anything. People like you never do. Judge Harlan Whitfield leaned over the bench of courtroom 4 like a man pronouncing weather, not destroying a life. Below him stood a 16-year-old in a borrowed church dress, hands cuffed in front of her, a small, water-stained booklet clutched between her fingers. She didn't cry. She didn't look down. She looked that judge dead in the eyes and said, in a voice steady as Sunday, "Yes, sir. We'll see." The gallery froze. The bailiff studied the floor. Her grandmother's hand flew to her mouth in the second row. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. That judge had no idea who that girl would become. He had no idea that exactly 20 years later, those same courtroom doors would open, that same girl would walk through them, and this time, he would be the one standing trial. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and it would take 2 decades to arrive. Have you ever had someone in power write you off in a single sentence? Hold that thought. Let me take you back to the beginning. Caldwell County, a town where the courthouse clock has been 7 minutes slow since 1981, and nobody with the authority to fix it has ever cared enough to try. On the east side of that town, in a narrow house with a blue tarp patching the roof, lived a girl named Keisha Mills and her grandmother, Geneva. Geneva Mills was 66 years old, stood 5 feet 2 inches, and had cleaned the Caldwell County Courthouse, every floor, every banister, every brass rail, for 34 years. 6 nights a week. She knew that building better than the men who ran it. She knew which step on the marble staircase wobbled. She knew that the portrait of the county's first judge hung crooked, and always would. And she knew courtroom 4 the way a farmer knows his field because she had polished its benches in the dark 10,000 times. Every school morning, Geneva packed Keisha's lunch in a brown paper bag, folded the top exactly twice, and set it by the door at 6:40. Every evening, she pressed Keisha's school clothes with an iron older than the refrigerator, smoothing the collar like it was a wedding dress. They had $1,280 a month between Geneva's wages and her late husband's pension, and somehow, out of that, there was always $1 for the church plate and a book on the table. Because here is what you need to understand about Geneva Mills. The county let her clean the law, so she decided to learn it. When the courthouse threw out old books, outdated codes, retired reporters with cracked spines, Geneva carried them home on the bus, one heavy bag at a time. And the crown of that second-hand library was a pocket-sized copy of the Constitution of the United States, paperback, sun-faded, its margins filled over 30 years with her small, upright handwriting, underlines, questions, stars next to the 14th Amendment, pressed so hard the pen had nearly torn the page. She read it to Keisha the way other grandmothers read fairy tales. "Equal protection of the laws," she'd say, tapping the page with one work-cracked finger. "It's a promise, baby. They don't always keep it. That's why somebody has to make them. Keep your eye on that little book. It is about to be thrown in the trash by a man in a black robe, and 20 years later, it is going to come back through those courtroom doors and bury him." Now let me tell you about the man in the robe. Judge Harlan Whitfield III. Third, that matters. His grandfather had been a judge. His father had been a judge. The Whitfield name was carved into the cornerstone of the county club and engraved on a brass plate at the law library, and Harlan had floated up through the system the way oil floats, effortlessly and always to the top. He wore French cuffs under his robe. He golfed on Wednesdays with the district attorney and the county commissioner, and his last 3 re-election campaigns had been quietly bankrolled by a company most voters had never heard of, Bright Path Juvenile Services, the private corporation that owned and operated the Regional Youth Detention Center. Hold on to that name, Bright Path. It's the loose thread this whole story unravels from. In Judge Whitfield's courtroom, the numbers told a story nobody wanted to read. Across the state, about 12% of juvenile cases ended in detention. In courtroom 4, it was 91%. 91. Kids came in for fistfights, for shoplifting, for skipping school, and they went out in vans with Bright Path painted on the side. Defense lawyers complained in hallways and never on the record. A legal aid attorney filed a formal grievance in 2003. It was dismissed in 11 days by a judicial review panel that included 2 of Whitfield's golfing partners. The system wasn't broken. The system was working exactly as it had been built to work, protecting its own and getting paid for it. And in the spring of 2006, that system looked up from its docket and saw a 16-year-old girl named Keisha Mills. Here's what actually happened, and I want you to hear every detail, because the details are the whole crime. Keisha was an honor student, vice president of the debate team. She had never, not once, been in trouble. On a Friday afternoon in April, her 17-year-old cousin Marcus asked her for a ride to the pharmacy on Route 9. Keisha had her learner's permit and her neighbor's borrowed Buick, and she said yes because that's what family says. She waited in the car with the radio on, doing her chemistry homework against the steering wheel. Inside, Marcus slipped 2 bottles of cologne and a phone charger into his jacket, $41 worth. He ran. The store manager got the plate. Keisha didn't run. When the police arrived at her grandmother's house that evening, she answered the door herself, confused, her homework still in her hand. She told the truth. She had driven the car. She didn't know what Marcus had planned. She had never even gone inside. It didn't matter. In Caldwell County in that decade, with her face and her address, she was charged as an accomplice. Her court-appointed lawyer, a tired man juggling 194 open cases, met her for the first time 11 minutes before the hearing. He told Geneva not to worry. First offense, honor student. Worst case, probation and community service. He said it the way you say things you've stopped believing. 11 minutes. Remember that number, because Keisha Mills was about to be sentenced to 11 months. The hearing was set for 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. Geneva took her first day off in 6 years. She put Keisha in the blue church dress, ironed twice, and into her granddaughter's hands. At the courthouse steps, she pressed the little pocket Constitution. "Hold it where he can see it," she said. "Remind him what room he's standing in. Now watch what happened in that room, slowly this time, all of it." Judge Whitfield came in 7 minutes late and didn't apologize because the clock in that courthouse only ran slow for some people. He looked at the file for what witnesses later swore was less than 30 seconds. Then he looked at Keisha. "Keisha," he said, dragging the name out, mispronouncing it the second time after being corrected the first. "Keisha, whatever that is." A ripple of laughter from somewhere near the prosecution table. He let it breathe. "States here you drove the getaway vehicle." "I drove my cousin to the store, Your Honor. I didn't know. Did I ask you a question, girl? You'll speak when spoken to." Her lawyer stood up. He got 9 words into a sentence about her grades before the gavel came down. Literally, 9 words. The court reporter's transcript proves it. You can count them yourself, and one day millions of people would. Geneva rose in the second row, her hat in her hands. "Your Honor, if I may, I raised this child. She is—" "Sit down, or you'll watch from the hallway." He didn't even look at her. 34 years that woman had polished his bench, and he didn't know her face. Then his eyes found the little book in Keisha's cuffed hands. "What is that?" "Bailiff. Bring me that." The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Otis Greer, who had nodded good evening to Geneva Mills for 2 decades of night shifts, hesitated for one human moment, then obeyed. He carried the little Constitution up to the bench like a man carrying something he'd rather not. Judge Whitfield flipped through it with 2 fingers, the way Patricia in another story held a cloth cap, the way small men handle other people's sacred things. He saw the underlines, the stars. 30 years of a cleaning woman's careful handwriting in the margins. He smirked. "A prop," he announced to the room. "Coach to wave the Constitution at me. They get cleverer every year." He held it out over the side of the bench and dropped it into his wastebasket. The sound it made was small. The sound it made was enormous. "Equal protection," he said, tasting the words like something spoiled. "Let me tell you what's equal, young lady. Consequences." He squared the file in front of him. 11 months. Bright path. Maybe structure will accomplish what your upbringing clearly could not. And then he leaned over that bench and he said it. The sentence under the sentence. The one he'd said in one form or another to hundreds of children whose names he never learned. "Look at me when I speak to you, girl. You'll never amount to anything. People like you never do." The gavel came down. $41 of cologne that another person stole. 11 months. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And in the second row, Geneva Mills did the only thing left to do. When the room emptied, the 66-year-old woman who cleaned that courtroom walked to the front of it, reached into the judge's wastebasket with the same hand that had polished his bench 10,000 times and lifted her Constitution out of the trash. She wiped it on her sleeve. She folded it into her purse. The night janitor found her there an hour later, sitting in the front row of the empty courtroom, holding her hat. She wasn't crying. She was memorizing. He threw away the wrong book, she told him. But what Judge Whitfield didn't know, what he could not have imagined as he drove his German sedan to Wednesday Golf, was that he hadn't ended a story that morning. He had started one, and to understand the woman who walks back through those doors 20 years later, you have to understand the woman who built her. Geneva Mills was born in 1940. In the summer of 1965, she walked to the county registrar's office to register to vote in her church dress with her birth certificate in an envelope. They handed her a literacy test with questions a law professor couldn't answer and failed her in 9 minutes. she walked home and she made a decision that bent the next 60 years. If they were going to use the law as a wall, she would learn every brick in it. She never got the classroom. She got the courthouse, with a mop. And she turned 34 years of night shifts into a one-woman law school. She read discarded opinions on her lunch break at midnight. She sat in the back of trials on her days off. Once, and Keisha was there, 8 years old, on a night Geneva couldn't find a sitter, she let the little girl climb up into the great leather chair in empty courtroom 4, and she stood below the bench looking up at her granddaughter and said the words that this entire story hangs on. One day, somebody who looks like you is going to sit in a room like this. And when she does, she's going to do it right. Equal means equal, baby. Make them keep the promise. So, when they took Keisha away in the Bright Path van, Geneva did not collapse. She visited every single Sunday, 11 months, 47 visits, never missed one, and every Sunday, she brought 2 things. A homemade pound cake for the guards, because Geneva believed in softening every door, and books, always books. And on the first visit, through the scratched glass, she pressed the little water-stained Constitution against the partition, pages out, so Keisha could read her grandmother's handwriting through the glass. He put it in the trash, Geneva said into the phone. It climbed out. So will you. Keisha served the 11 months, every one of them. She came out 17 with a record and watched the doors close one by one. The scholarship withdrawn, the debate team gone, the guidance counselor who suggested gently that maybe community college was more realistic for someone in her situation. There's that phrase again, someone like her, people like you. Write it down somewhere, because in 20 years it's going to be read aloud in a federal courtroom as evidence. What did she do? She got the GED, top score in the county, community college, president's list, every semester, while working 30 hours a week bagging groceries. Then the transfer scholarship to Howard, where a professor read her admissions essay about a courtroom wastebasket and called her into his office to ask if it was true. Then law school, Yale, full ride, where her study copy of the Constitution had 2 sets of handwriting in the margins, hers in blue, and photocopied pages of Geneva's, taped in fading black. Then the clerkship. Then 7 years as a federal prosecutor, where she built a reputation with 2 trademarks. She never raised her voice, and she never lost the cases everyone said were unwinnable. Calm equals power. She'd learned that at 16, in handcuffs, saying, "We'll see." Geneva lived to see almost all of it. She sat in the front row at the law school graduation in a new blue hat, and when they read out Keisha Geneva Mills, she stood up by herself, alone in the whole crowd, and nobody had the heart to tell a 79-year-old courthouse cleaner to sit down. She passed in 2021, in her sleep, the radio still playing gospel, the little Constitution on the nightstand where the Bible kept it company. At the funeral, Keisha put nothing on the casket. She laid her hand on it and made one promise. Equal means equal, Grandma. I'm going to make them keep it. 3 years later, at 36, Keisha Mills was confirmed as the youngest United States attorney in the history of her district. And 4 months after that, a federal grand jury 2 counties over handed up an indictment that made the entire state inhale at once. United States versus Harlan Whitfield III. Honest services fraud, bribery, conspiracy. The FBI had followed the money. $1. $4 million over 14 years, rooted through a judicial education foundation, from Bright Path Juvenile Services to the man in courtroom 4. The math was as simple as it was sickening. Bright Path billed the state $312 per child per night. Whitfield kept the beds full. 3,112 children had passed through his courtroom into Bright Path custody. 3,112. The first trial ended in a mistrial, a hung jury, 11-1, with one holdout the papers politely called a longtime admirer of the Whitfield family. His lawyers celebrated on the courthouse steps. They called the case a politically motivated stumble and predicted the government wouldn't have the stomach for a second round. They were half right. The government didn't send the same prosecutors for the second round. It sent her. The retrial was assigned by pure scheduling coincidence, or by something older than coincidence depending on what you believe, to the renovated federal annex that the county had carved out of the old courthouse. Courtroom 4, the same marble staircase with the wobbling step, the same crooked portrait, the same benches a woman named Geneva Mills had polished in the dark for 34 years. Opening day. The gallery was full an hour early, reporters in the back rows, and scattered through the crowd, quietly in their Sunday best, sat people you've already met. Otis Greer, the bailiff, retired now, his hat on his knee. The legal aid lawyer who filed the 2003 grievance, gray at the temples. The court reporter whose transcript counted 9 words, and row after row of grown men and women in their 30s who had one thing in common: they had all, once, been children in a Bright Path van. Whitfield arrived in a charcoal suit, 71 years old, tanned from a season of golf, flanked by 3 lawyers at $1,100 an hour. He looked relaxed. His lead attorney was telling him something amusing. At 8:58 a.m., the doors at the back of courtroom 4 opened. The room turned, the way rooms do. A woman walked down the center aisle, alone, carrying a single worn leather briefcase. Charcoal dress, no jewelry except small gold earrings. She walked without hurry, calm as Sunday, to the government's table, set down the briefcase, and took out exactly 2 things: a legal pad and a small water-stained paperback book, its margins dark with 2 generations of handwriting, which she placed on the corner of the table, squared neatly to the edge, facing the bench. "Counsel, your appearance for the record?" "Keisha Mills, United States Attorney, for the government, Your Honor." You could watch it land. The name crossed the room like a dropped glass. Whitfield had been reading something. His head came up slowly, his eyes found her face, and then, the gallery would describe it 100 ways to 100 reporters, but Otis Greer said it best. The man went white as his own collar. The color drained from him in real time. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. Whitfield didn't answer. He was staring at the little book on the corner of her table. He recognized it. 20 years, 3,000 children, and he recognized it, which tells you he had always known, somewhere under the robe, exactly what he had thrown away. His lawyers asked for a recess before the first witness was ever called. Then they did something desperate. They moved to disqualify her, claiming bias, citing a personal history with the defendant. Keisha stood. She didn't raise her voice. People who were there say you had to lean in, and that leaning in was the point. Your Honor, the defense is correct that I have history with this defendant. So do 3,111 other children, and the government will be calling several of them. If having once stood in his courtroom disqualifies a person from seeking justice in this one, the defense should be prepared to disqualify half this county. I was screened, cleared, and assigned by Main Justice precisely because every fact of my history is public. I'm not here in spite of it. I'm here because the United States keeps its promises late, but it keeps them. Motion denied. The trial took 9 days, and she conducted it like her grandmother polished brass, methodically, completely, no corner skipped. She never once mentioned her own case in front of the jury. She didn't need to. She had the ledger from the Education Foundation, 14 years of wire transfers, each one landing within days of a sentencing surge. She had the Bright Path executive who flipped, sweating through his deposition, explaining the phrase that appeared in internal emails: occupancy partner. She had the statistician who put the chart on the screen, 12% statewide, 91% in courtroom 4, and let the jury sit in silence with that mountain on the wall. And she had the children, grown now, one by one, a welder, a nurse's aide, a man who had been homeless for 6 years after Bright Path. Each one stating, for the record, their age at sentencing, their offense, and their sentence. 13 years old, a schoolyard fight, 9 months. 15, a stolen bicycle, 7 months. 14, truancy, 6 months. She asked each of them one final question, the same question, soft as a hymn. What did the judge say to you before you were taken away? And one after another, in a federal courtroom, under oath, they said it. He said I'd never amount to anything. He said people like me never do. He said, people like you. 4 words, falling like a gavel, over and over, until the jurors stopped taking notes and just watched the defense table. On day 6, a juror in the second row wiped her eyes. On day 9, the defense rested after 40 minutes. There was nothing to say. There had never been anything to say. There had only been for 14 years nobody with the standing to make him answer. The jury was out for 4 hours and 11 minutes. 4 hours, 11 minutes, 11. Even the clock, in the end, insisted on the number. On count 1, guilty. On count 2, guilty. On count 3, guilty. Guilty. All counts. Whitfield gripped the table. 71 years of floating, and the floor finally opened. At sentencing, 3 months later, the federal judge gave him 17 years, and in a detail the newspapers could not resist, ordered restitution that began the dismantling of the Whitfield Family Trust. The man who sold children at $312 a night will, in all likelihood, spend the rest of his life in federal custody. Keisha attended the sentencing and said nothing, but as the marshals walked him up the aisle past the government's table, he stopped, just for a second, in front of her, Nobody knows what he meant to say. She didn't give him time. She picked up the little water-stained Constitution, held it where he could see it, and said quietly, the way you close a door, "You'll speak when spoken to." The marshals moved him along. There is one more scene from those 9 days that the cameras never caught, and it might be my favorite in the whole story. On the morning of day 4, before the gallery was let in, Keisha arrived early, she always arrives early, and found an old man already in the front row, hat on his knee. Otis Greer, the bailiff, the man whose hands had carried the little book up to the bench in 2006 and dropped it into reach of a smirk. He stood up when he saw her. It took him a moment to get the words out. "I've thought about that morning for 20 years, he said. "I had one moment, and I handed it up to him. I'm sorry, Miss Mills. I should have been slower. I should have been something." And Keisha, who had every right in the world to let that apology just sit there, shook her head. "Mr. Greer, my grandmother fed you pound cake for 2 decades. You think she didn't know exactly who you were? She used to say you nodded to her like she was somebody every night when the men in suits walked past her like a coat rack. She nodded toward the witness list on her table. You're testifying Thursday. You remember what he said to those kids better than anybody because you were standing closest. So no, you don't get to be sorry. You get to be useful." Otis Greer testified on Thursday. He was, jurors said afterward, devastating. But the verdict was only the beginning, because what happened next changed the entire state. The court reporter's transcript from 2006, 9 words from a defense lawyer before the gavel, went viral alongside courtroom audio from the retrial, and the hashtag she came back trended for 6 days. The state Supreme Court ordered review of every juvenile case Whitfield had ever touched, 3,112 files.